For more than 10,000 years of human history, life moved in rhythm with nature. The sun was the original clock. People woke when light spread across fields and stopped working when darkness covered the land. There were no factories, no fixed schedules, and no machines dictating the pace of life. Everything was tied to natural cycles, seasons, rainfall, harvests, and daylight. Work was physical but not mechanical. Power came from human strength, animals, wind, and water, a plow pulled by a horse, a mill turned by a river, a sail carried by the wind. These forces shaped civilization slowly, gently, and predictably. In the early 1700s, even the busiest cities still carried this ancient rhythm. A merchant from that time could travel through trade networks and still recognize the world of centuries before. Goods were handmade. Production was scattered across villages, cottages, and small workshops. Nothing moved quickly and nothing changed rapidly. Wealth was also defined differently. It was measured in land, crops, livestock, and craftsmanship, not in speed or output. A successful society depended on fertile soil, stable weather, and patient labor. Even growing towns remained deeply connected to nature. Roads turned muddy after rain, rivers dictated trade routes, and bad harvests could disrupt entire regions. This was the old world, slow, stable, and familiar. But beneath this calm surface, change was quietly building. In England, deep underground, vast coal deposits lay untouched, ancient energy stored over millions of years. At the same time, the country was developing strong trade networks, busy ports, and expanding markets. Money, goods, and people were becoming more connected than ever before. A shift in demand was also taking place. One of the strongest forces was textiles. Cloth was no longer just a basic necessity. It became a symbol of comfort, identity, and social status. Cotton in particular became highly desirable, light, durable, and suitable for a growing population, but demand was rising faster than production. The traditional system could not keep up forever. At that time, most production happened through the putting-out system. Merchants delivered raw materials to households, where families spun yarn and wove cloth using simple tools. It was decentralized, slow, and dependent on human labor. For a while it worked, but markets expanded, populations grew, and global trade intensified. Pressure began to build on the system. Merchants wanted faster production and lower costs. Consumers wanted more goods at cheaper prices. Competition increased, especially from international markets where textiles were already highly developed. And slowly something important happened. The old system started reaching its limits. It was not collapsing suddenly, it was stretching, straining, and becoming inefficient under demand. At the same time, England had already developed certain conditions that made transformation possible. Agriculture had improved significantly. Better farming methods, crop rotation, and selective breeding increased food production. Fewer workers were needed on farms, which created a surplus labor force. This was crucial, because for the first time, large numbers of people were free to leave the land and seek work elsewhere. Political stability also played a major role. England had relatively strong legal systems that protected property rights and encouraged investment. People could take risks knowing their ideas and money were somewhat secure. Banks and financial institutions began to grow. They made it possible to collect large pools of capital money that could be used for experiments, machines, and large-scale production. This reduced the risk of innovation. Geography helped as well. England was an island with an extensive coastline, navigable rivers, and active ports. This made transportation of goods efficient both internally and internationally. Raw materials could arrive easily, and finished goods could be exported quickly. But perhaps the most important factor was a change in thinking. A new mindset was emerging, shaped by science, observation, and experimentation. People began to believe that nature could be studied, measured, and controlled. Instead of accepting limitations, they began asking, what if we could overcome them? And finally, there was a critical economic condition. Labor was expensive, but energy was cheap. Wages for workers were relatively high, while coal buried beneath the ground in vast quantities was cheap and abundant. This created a powerful incentive. If machines powered by coal could replace human labor, production would become faster and cheaper. And that idea changed everything. Because once energy becomes something you can purchase and scale, human life stops setting the pace of production. Machines begin to take over. And England was standing exactly at that turning point. Pressure from rising demand, global trade competition, and internal economic change was pushing the country towards something new. Not a small improvement, but a complete transformation. The old world of hand production and natural rhythm was about to collide with a new world of speed, machines, and industrial power. And the first sparks of that revolution were already beginning to appear. At first, the change did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. There were no factories dominating skylines yet, no roaring engines shaking the ground, no smoke-filled industrial cities. Instead, the transformation began quietly, inside homes, workshops, and small weaving rooms where families had worked for generations. This was the world of the putting-out system. Merchants supplied raw cotton to rural households. Families spun it into yarn beside hearths, and weavers turned it into cloth using simple handlooms. Every step depended on human effort, patience, and skill passed down over time. It was slow, but it was stable. For a while, it was enough. Then demand changed everything. Cotton cloth was no longer just a local product. It became a global commodity valued across Europe and the expanding colonial markets. It was light, practical, and increasingly fashionable. As demand rose, merchants pushed harder for speed and volume, and the old system began to strain, because human hands could only do so much. Production could not keep pace with consumption. A pressure point formed, and in that pressure, innovation began. The first breakthrough was simple but powerful: the flying shuttle. Before it, weaving required constant manual effort, passing thread back and forth by hand. The flying shuttle changed that rhythm. It allowed a single weaver to move faster and produce wider fabric with less effort. It seemed like a small improvement, but its impact was enormous. Weaving became faster than spinning, and that imbalance created a new crisis. Now the loom could consume yarn faster than it could be produced. A bottleneck had formed, and in an industrializing world, bottlenecks were not just problems. They were opportunities. James Hargreaves responded with the spinning jenny. For the first time, one worker could spin multiple threads at once. Productivity multiplied without requiring a proportional increase in labor. It was compact, simple, and could still fit inside homes. At first, it felt like an extension of traditional work. But underneath, something fundamental had changed. Production was no longer limited by human physical capacity. It was becoming mechanical. Still, demand kept growing, and now incremental improvement was not enough. A larger force was needed. This led to Richard Arkwright's water frame. Unlike earlier devices, this machine was too large and too powerful for a household. It required continuous energy, and that energy came from flowing water. This necessity changed everything, because machines could no longer live inside homes. They required space, structure, coordination, and so the first true factories began to emerge. For the first time in history, workers and machines were brought together under one roof, not as equals, but as parts of a system. The factory introduced a new logic. Time could be measured, work could be standardized, output could be predicted, labor could be supervised. The rhythm of life stopped following the household. It started following the machine. Then came the spinning mule, invented by Samuel Crompton. It combined the strengths of earlier machines and produced thread that was both strong and fine. This allowed textile quality to improve while production expanded massively. Each invention solved a problem and immediately created a new one. Weaving led to spinning problems. Spinning improvements led to demand surges. Demand surges forced larger machines. It was a chain reaction, a system of acceleration that had no natural stopping point. And at the center of it all was one industry, textiles, because cotton was no longer just cloth. It had become the engine of industrial expansion. But this transformation was not just technological. It reshaped human relationships with work. In the cottage system, skill lived inside the worker. In the factory system, the worker became part of the machine's rhythm. Craft gave way to repetition. Flexibility gave way to discipline, and scattered production gave way to concentrated industrial centers. Meanwhile, beyond England, the impact was devastating. In regions like India, where textile craftsmanship had once set global standards, local industries struggled to survive. Machine-produced British cloth was cheaper and faster to produce, flooding markets and undercutting traditional artisans. Skill was no longer enough. Price became the deciding force. Back in England, factories began pulling workers from rural areas. For many families, this seemed like opportunity, steady wages, predictable income, survival beyond farming uncertainty. But it came with a hidden cost. Work became intense, continuous, and regulated. Machines did not pause for human limits. They demanded constant attention. And so life itself began to shift. From seasonal rhythms, to mechanical schedules, from scattered homes, to centralized factories, from independence, to structured labor. But even this new system had limits. Because water power still tied factories to rivers, and rivers were unpredictable. They could freeze in winter, flood in storms, or simply run dry. Industry was growing fast, but it was still chained to nature. And to break that final limitation, England needed a new kind of energy. A force that did not depend on weather, geography, or seasons. A force that could be summoned anywhere, anytime, and that force was waiting underground in coal. Deep beneath England's surface, another story was unfolding, one far less visible but far more powerful. Coal mining had become essential to the growing economy, but extracting it was becoming increasingly difficult. The deeper miners went, the more the earth resisted. Water flooded tunnels, filled shafts, and turned progress into constant struggle. Every new seam of coal came with a new problem, flooding, and traditional methods were no longer enough. Human effort could not match the scale of the challenge. This is where necessity forced invention. The earliest steam engines were not designed for industry as we know it today. They were built for one urgent purpose: to drain water from mines. Thomas Newcomen's engine was among the first to succeed. It was massive, slow, and inefficient. It consumed large amounts of coal and required constant maintenance. Yet despite its flaws, it solved a critical problem. It worked reliably. For the first time, humans had a machine that could perform continuous mechanical work independent of wind or flowing water. But the real breakthrough came when James Watt entered the picture. He observed a fundamental inefficiency in the system. The repeated heating and cooling of the same cylinder wasted enormous energy. His solution, the separate condenser, was deceptively simple, but its consequences were revolutionary. It dramatically improved efficiency, transforming the steam engine from a specialized mining tool into a general-purpose power source. At that moment, everything changed. Steam was no longer limited to draining mines. It could now power machines directly. Factories were no longer bound to rivers. They could be built anywhere, near coal fields, near cities, near ports, near labor. Geography stopped being a limitation. Power became portable, and with portability came concentration. Factories grew larger, machines multiplied, production increased at an unprecedented rate. The rhythm of life began to shift again, no longer guided by sunlight or water flow, but by engines that could run day and night. Steam did not just replace human and animal power, it multiplied it. A small group of workers could now control machines that produced what once required entire communities. But steam alone did not complete the transformation. It demanded stronger materials. And that need drove the rise of iron production on a massive scale. For centuries, iron had been limited by the availability of charcoal, which depended on forests. This natural restriction kept production relatively small. Coal changed that. By converting coal into coke, furnaces could reach much higher temperatures, allowing iron to be produced faster and in greater quantities. This led to innovations like puddling and rolling, which made iron stronger and more usable. Iron was no longer rare. It became the foundation of industrial expansion. Bridges were built across rivers that once divided regions. Machines became larger and more complex. Factories turned into massive structures of steel and stone. And soon, transportation itself was transformed. Railways began to appear, powered by steam, built with iron, and capable of moving goods and people faster than ever before. The country was being stitched together by tracks, engines, and schedules. Everything was accelerating. A self-reinforcing system began to form. More coal enabled more steam power. More steam power increased production. More production required more iron. More iron allowed better machines and infrastructure. Better infrastructure made expansion even faster. It was a loop, a cycle of continuous industrial growth. For the first time, economic expansion was not limited by nature alone. It was driven by itself. But this acceleration came at a cost. Inside mines, factories, and ironworks, conditions were harsh. Workers endured extreme heat, dangerous machinery, and exhausting labor. The industrial miracle was built not just with innovation, but with human sacrifice. Still, nothing could stop the momentum now. Cities began to expand rapidly. Small towns transformed into industrial centers. People migrated in large numbers from rural areas seeking work in factories. Entire populations were reorganized around industry. The landscape itself changed. Fields became buildings. Villages became cities, air became filled with smoke. And with this transformation, a new reality emerged. Power was no longer scattered, it was concentrated, controlled. And constantly growing. Steam and iron had not just changed production. They had created a new kind of world, one defined by speed, scale, and relentless motion. And as this system expanded, it began to reshape not only how things were made, but how people lived. As steam and iron reshaped production, they also reshaped people's lives in ways no one could fully control. The countryside, which had once been the center of life for centuries, began to empty. Families left farms and villages behind, pulled toward the growing industrial towns where factories promised steady wages. It was not a slow shift. It was a movement, large, continuous, and irreversible. Cities like Manchester expanded at a speed that outpaced any sense of planning. Streets appeared almost overnight. Rows of brick houses were built quickly to house workers flooding in from rural areas. The result was dense, overcrowded neighborhoods where space was limited and conditions were harsh. Inside these growing cities, life became compressed. Homes were small and tightly packed, clean water was scarce, waste disposal systems were underdeveloped, smoke from factories darkened the air and the smell of coal became part of everyday life. What had once been open land and quiet villages turned into industrial landscapes filled with noise, movement, and constant activity. But this rapid growth brought serious consequences. Disease spread easily in overcrowded districts. Cholera and typhoid became frequent outbreaks, not rare events. The industrial city offered employment, but it also demanded resilience in conditions that were often dangerous and unhealthy. Work itself changed dramatically. Inside factories, time was no longer flexible. It was structured, measured, and enforced. The rhythm of life was dictated by the factory clock, not by daylight or seasons. Work hours were long, often stretching from early morning to late evening, 6 days a week. Machines did not pause for fatigue, and workers had to match their pace. In many cases, those workers included women and children. Child labor became a widespread feature of early industrial society. Children were employed because they were small enough to reach tight spaces in machines and because they were cheaper to employ. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, often performing repetitive and dangerous tasks. It was not a new idea that children worked, but industrialization made it systematic, large-scale, and unavoidable within the factory system. As productivity increased, so did human exhaustion. Yet over time, the reality inside factories and cities became impossible to ignore. Writers, reformers, and social critics began documenting conditions. Reports of long working hours, unsafe environments, and child labor began reaching wider audiences. Public awareness slowly started to grow. Pressure for change increased. This led to early reforms such as Factory Acts, which began to limit working hours, especially for children, and introduced basic protections for workers. These changes did not happen quickly or easily, but they marked the beginning of regulation within industrial society. At the same time, industrialization also created new social structures. A middle class began to emerge, made up of managers, engineers, merchants, and clerks. These were people who did not own land in the traditional sense, but whose lives were connected to industry and commerce. For them, life offered new opportunities. Goods became cheaper and more widely available. Products that were once considered luxuries, cotton clothing, sugar, tea, printed books, became part of everyday life. Consumption itself began to change society. The city was no longer just a place of labor. It became a place of living, buying, and desire. But beneath this new comfort, tension remained. Because industrial progress was uneven, while some experienced rising living standards, others struggled with harsh working conditions and unstable livelihoods. Skilled artisans whose craft once defined their value found themselves replaced by machines that could produce faster and cheaper. For many, this was not just economic loss, it was personal identity collapsing. Resistance followed. Some workers reacted with anger, destroying machines they saw as responsible for their hardship. These actions were often labeled as anti-progress, but at their core, they reflected deeper fears: fear of being replaced, of losing purpose, of becoming irrelevant in a new system. Over time, workers began to organize. They realized that individual effort was weak compared to collective action. This led to the formation of unions and early labor movements. Workers began negotiating for better wages, safer conditions, and shorter hours. A new kind of power was emerging not from machines, but from people acting together. Meanwhile, intellectual life also reacted to the transformation. Some thinkers celebrated industrialization as progress, a sign of national strength, productivity, and innovation. Others saw it as exploitation disguised as advancement. Artists and writers described polluted skies, crowded streets, and the emotional cost of rapid change. Reformers counted suffering. Engineers continued building. There was no single interpretation of what was happening. Only competing perspectives, all trying to make sense of a world that was changing faster than understanding could keep up with. By the time England fully emerged as an industrial powerhouse, the transformation was complete. But it was not just industry that had changed, it was life itself, the way people worked, the way they measured time, the way they understood value and labor, the way society organized itself. Human existence had shifted from natural rhythms to mechanical ones, from seasons to schedules, from craft to production, from scattered living to industrial concentration. The modern world had arrived, built on steam and iron, powered by coal and shaped by machines that never stopped. But it also carried a shadow, a reminder that every leap forward comes with a cost that history never forgets. Forward comes with a cost that history never forgets.